Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of the Rebel Crone and my wisdom interviews. And today I'm very excited to have a dear friend of mine that I've known for over 20 years, believe it or not. It's been that long, who is a psychologist. She's a doctor. She's also a professor of psychology. Oh my gosh, I could just go on and on with her credentials, but some of the ones that are really important to what we're going to be talking about in the next little while is she's also a certified practitioner and a researcher with the Heart Math Institute, which I think we'll do a whole other video on that because that is just such a fascinating topic. But welcome, Maria.
Oh, thank you so much, Elisa. Wonderful to be here with you, visiting my dear friend and talking about this very important topic.
I do, and this important topic is it really sprung up. We had an interesting conversation last night having to do with this whole scandal right now that's happening in the Olympics and especially in women's boxing. And there's two women boxers in particular that have been really being called out as being not female, not, everybody's like very confused of, are these really, who are they? Are they men and, pretending to be women? Do they have, biologically what's going on? We really don't, people don't know. There's a lot of speculation out there. I also did a video a while back called Woke versus Awake. And in it, I made a statement based on my feelings, not on research, but based on feelings that there's, X chromosomes and XY, and you're either one or the other. What's the problem? Well, Maria, my dear friend, filled me in on what the problem is with that, because it's a much more complex situation that a lot of us realize, and this is her area of expertise. So we're going to deep dive into how do we put that into really gender identity and how it develops over time, starting in utero and on. So I'm going to pass the mic to you, Maria, and could you start by just kind of breaking down what's going on in the human body?
Absolutely, and this is so important for all of us to understand that there are biological things that determine what our bodies look like and how they function. And speaking specifically about gender identity, this begins to form inside your mother's womb, in utero. So gender identity is defined as our personal sense of what our gender is, but it is influenced by mostly biological factors, possibly some social factors, though the research for that is minimal. The research regarding the biological elements of gender identity is incontrovertible. So what we see is that gender identity becomes influenced primarily by hormones and genetics. That's what the research says. And there are two primary times in our life cycle when those influences can occur. One is prenatally, like we said, when the hormones are forming in the embryo. And certain things can interfere with that process.
Well, that's interesting. So that there is a natural biological mechanism in place, is what you're saying, that's going to determine how this little fetus is going to form.
Absolutely.
And it's pretty clear this or this, but there are things that can get in the way. Could you talk about a few of those?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there are critical times in the development of the fetus inside the mother's womb, and different things develop. Like at some points the heart is developing, or the brain is developing, or the muscles or the bones, and it's quite a complex and fascinating process. And so sometimes things can happen to alter the course of development. And so we are very familiar with things that happen that can be considered to be birth defects. For example, a child may have a heart problem, and it probably happened because of some influences on the mother's body, while that child was inside of her.
Good. And influences, you had a big name for it last
Oh, yes.
night. What was that big name?
So the big name that we were speaking of is teratogens. So teratogens are considered to be toxins that come into the mother's body, and they influence the formation of the organs and the physiology of the child. So certain things are clearly disorders, like if your heart valve doesn't work, that we can clearly call that a disorder.
Spina bifida.
Exactly,
there's all kinds of little
things like that. It can influence chromosome formation. It can influence the amount of hormones that come into the child. But I think it's really important to consider here that not everything, there is no one, say, correct gender identity. There is a fluidity of combinations of hormone levels that create each one of us as our own personal self, and then we have a personal sense of who that is. So just because things come in that change the composition of things doesn't mean that it is faulty. It doesn't mean that it's a disorder. And I think that that's a really important basic philosophical thing to consider.
I think that's important. And just to kind of go back a minute, in because a lot of us, we hear a lot of buzzwords out now, like binary, non-binary, and some of it just goes by me. I'm just like, yeah, okay, whatever. It just, I kind of tune out because it's getting like so complex. But I think the binary, non-binary is a really important thing. We were talking about it and how, let me see if I get this right, that in a binary, it's like this, that's black, it's white, it's male, it's female. And it's really, you think of the 50s, and I think of Leave It to Beaver, and there's the Cleavers, and very female, very male, and there are these like sets.
Very simplistic.
Very, very simplistic.
And the world is actually way more complex than that.
It's way more complex. And then Maria was saying how there's this whole spectrum in between, this big old spectrum. And what's that dividing line? What is that, and who's like close? And that's where we get into tricky things, probably with women's sports and stuff. We won't go there right now, but just, that dividing line. But it's just, society, we have tended to have things filtered into, oh, you're pink, you're blue, you play with dolls, you play with trucks.
To be black and white.
Black and white with
Sometimes that feels a little easier to try to figure out the complexities.
But the world we're in right now, that cat's out of the bag. We're not in the generation we grew up in where it was little boys and little girls.
We were considered that. It doesn't mean it was real.
It doesn't mean it was
accurate.
Yeah, exactly. But we conformed, or things were kept on the hush-hush, and children were, what we have today is a different situation.
It's a different world, thankfully. We have a lot more openness to considering diversity and variation of individual expression. And so glad that that's the case, because most of us humans don't fit into a really tight little box.
No. And that's what in the video, if some of you watched it, I started sharing, my personal journey when I was a little girl, like I was just me, and this whole boy girl thing seemed like, well, why are you trying to put boy girl on me? Because I want to roughhouse with my brother, I want to climb trees, and I want to play with my dolls, and I have a lot of nice fashion for my dolls. I want to do all of that. So you were sharing with me that up to a certain age, there is more of like a fluidity that made sense, where you're not like picking a gender, you're not identifying as a gender.
Absolutely. And if we think about our development psychologically and physically, we can see that kind of fluidity. People don't acquire their final identity or appearance all that easily or quickly or concretely. Sometimes we have growth spurts, and sometimes we don't, and sometimes people put on weight, and sometimes they slim down. And it's a very fluid process. With gender identity, what the research shows is that gender identity begins to form in the child around age 2 to 3. And about age 4, it's starting to be more consistent and stable. And by age 7, typically, children have come up with a clear sense
of who they are.
Whoever that is. Whoever that is, and if they're not limited by names and titles, they can express who they are. So after age 7, when that has coalesced, there's another period of fluidity.
And is there another hormonal surge?
So there's another hormonal
at that
surge
age?
at puberty. At puberty.
Okay.
But there's at age 7, children are exploring the world, and they're exploring their interactions with their friends and with their family and at school. And so there's an excitement about seeing what's out there in the
And
world.
who am I?
Who am I? And so there is a sense of fluidity and play acting and, you know, working with your roles and the roles of the world that have been presented to you, and then comes puberty.
And then in my video I was talking about, and other people like commented and related to it, that there was a certain point when I had a crush on the neighborhood girl. And I hope she watches this sometime. Maybe I hope she doesn't watch it. But anyways, it was very innocent and sweet, but I was just crazy about her. But it was just like feelings coming up and figuring things out.
Absolutely.
It didn't mean I had a preference one way or the other.
We're always trying to figure things out.
I was figuring it out, and I had feelings.
Right.
You know?
And that's perfectly natural and normal, and it doesn't have to be, you know, captured as a moment in time that defines a person. There are many moments in time that define us.
And thank God we didn't have to be defined by those moments.
Exactly.
Right.
We've all had all kinds of moments, I'm sure. And the moments keep shifting all the way through to the time that we're not here anymore.
Okay, so puberty then,
there's another influx
of estrogen
of
or
hormones.
testosterone, right?
Correct.
Specifically
yes,
those two.
the sex hormones.
Okay.
There's another influx. We all know what puberty looks like. And it feels very chaotic.
Challenging, yes.
It feels chaotic to everybody. It feels chaotic to the adolescent that's going through it. It feels chaotic to the parents, to the society, everybody, because it's like boom, 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 boom. We're getting bombarded. You know, we're getting shaped. We're getting shaped from a sex hormone standpoint. So the first shot is prenatally. The second shot is puberty.
And the thing that comes to my mind with that is how powerful hormones are.
Absolutely.
How incredibly powerful. And then I've talked in several videos about in our crone years as we enter past menopause, when those go away, how it dramatically shifts it. And from this point of view, looking back, I see how much the dictates of hormones drove my life and controlled it. So they're very powerful things.
Interestingly, as well, as we age, the balance of hormones shifts again. So typically women have more testosterone than they did, men have more estrogen than they did.
Towards the end.
Generally speaking, keeping in mind that there's a continuum.
Right.
But there is a shift that occurs as we exit that middle age period.
That's so interesting. So theoretically, that would mean that we could understand each other better, because I have more testosterone, he has more estrogen, excuse me. And so conversely, we're coming more towards the center.
That often happens.
But a lot of it's but that's a whole other
story. That's
another day. I want to really stick into this because I think it's super important that I just, I confess that I had simplified the whole thing to, you're this or this. Let's not get all like too detailed about stuff.
It's natural for humans to want to simplify things, but we really cannot give ourselves that luxury. The world and humans, all of us, are very complex, and just as we ourselves would not want to be dumbed down or simplified, it is not something that is accurate, and it is not something that is loving or compassionate to assign to anyone, to put somebody in this tiny little box that doesn't fit.
Right, it's so true. So basically what we're saying is that there are so many, like just within the development, we've gone through puberty, and that the rush of hormones, it varies. In utero, it's going to vary between the mother and the mother's body, and maybe mother
and the
health,
things that come into the mother's body,
all of that will give different.
It's like an artist's palette. Different elements are put on the palette.
And you can only paint a picture with the colors you have.
Exactly. And it doesn't mean that picture is good or bad.
It is just the picture.
It's the picture. It's what it is.
Okay, so then there's so when we're younger, up to like 7, things are starting to coalesce. Then pretty much children are going to say, I'm going to know.
I'm this or I'm that.
I'm this or that. And within that, I feel like maybe I'm a little boy, but I'm feeling these other things. I'm feeling other tendencies or other
And
in the spectrum.
absolutely. It depends on the child. It depends on their own awareness, on their capacity for communicating what
Yeah.
they're experiencing. You know how that goes. So we don't always communicate all that clearly about what's going on in our experience.
And then, especially, and then the next stage during puberty, where there's another powerful influx of sex hormones into the body.
Yes.
And then now, because you're not influenced by the mother's body, it's going to be strictly
internal.
internal.
It's your own formation of this body.
Yeah. And one of the things with that I think is really interesting, what we were talking about last night, is that it actually will, the hormones and this whole development forms a biological structure, especially in the brain.
Absolutely.
The brain is formed under the influence of
it
varying degrees of hormones.
Exactly. The hormonal influences have a large part to play in developing brain structures, and there are uniquely identified brain structures that are typical for individuals who identify as male or identify as female, or different variations of that. It is incontrovertible evidence. We look at the brain scans.
Yeah, you're saying there's one part of the brain.
There's a particular part of the brain, and I believe it's in the basal ganglia, and we'll provide some links of research articles for anyone who wants to check that out. But there is this one particular area of the brain in particular that responds to the hormonal pattern. And so
it's measurable,
and it's measurable. Yeah, there it is on a brain scan.
You may think that this is a boy biologically, but this is a feminine structure.
Exactly. And then that person, that child or that adult, would likely have a gender identity of female.
Yeah,
it matches the brain,
and it's not a choice thing. Their brain has developed.
It is a biological event. And a process and a structure. It's not like one day you suddenly decided you wanted to try out a different gender.
Right? It's like, I think I'm going to try that out.
So sometimes I think that people confuse gender identity with different kinds of stereotypical preferences or abilities, like historically, and thankfully we don't think that much this way anymore. But historically, it was thought that boys were better at thinking and girls were better at feeling.
Right.
And of course, we know that is just a very simplistic approach to understanding
I like
humanity.
more like there's like a masculine principle of things and a feminine principle, and some have different tendencies, and we're all blended.
And there's blending, and there's a
that
continuum, and then it's just like different paintings, different combinations of colors and textures. And so sometimes I think people get a little confused by saying, oh, well, that person, that individual, is a very strong feeler, so therefore they must be female. And if there's someone who doesn't appear to be female or identify as female with strong feelings, then perhaps people get confused. And when people get confused, often there's judgment that comes with it, to try to, self-protect from that confusion. So it is so helpful for us to discuss these things and really see what the science is behind it all.
Right, because it is I think that's really powerful. You just said about how we're really protecting a certain viewpoint of ourselves, so we can feel better about ourselves.
Absolutely.
We feel a safer model of the world.
Yes.
And
it often doesn't have to do with anybody else. It has to do with us.
With us. And so we start that's all, I look at all judgmental things, these judgy things is because we're trying to, we cast somebody down so we can lift ourselves up.
Absolutely.
Or we just make you wrong so I can be right.
Exactly.
And I think this is a dangerous area.
That is the black and white thinking right there.
Yeah.
For me to be right, you have to be wrong. And it is something that we're working on as a global society.
Oh, I feel like that's a big one. It's just you know what? It's right. If it's right for me, it's right for me. You're right for you is right for you. And how cool. And for me personally, how I feel like I've grown and developed as my level of curiosity is if somebody talks about something, other people, oh, that's crazy. I'm like, So tell me, why do you think that way?
I'm curious.
I'm curious. Explain to me. Like,
Right.
I've talked to someone the other day about the flat earther community. They're like, oh my God, and they lost their mind over it. It's like, well, I do different things with that. I'm like, all right, these are intelligent people, and why do they think this? So I want to research, I want to look into it, as opposed to judge it, because then I learn things. Maybe I change my mind, maybe I don't, but I tell you what, I learn stuff.
Exactly, and it's beautiful when we care about one another enough to learn about that person and their life and their story and their way of understanding themselves and their place in life. We all benefit from that.
And so that's a perfect segue to this young gal, I think Khalif, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, the boxer that, it's just this huge controversy on. I did watch a little while ago. I looked on YouTube and some things, and they had an interview of her, and she spoke out about it, and she was just it was very devastating, and she was crying, and she's like, I am a woman. I've always been a woman. And just like the impact on her. And if you think like this is not some kind of we're not talking about the little swimmers last year where there was a boy, a physiological male with a penis that said, I identify as a girl, and so I'm going to compete against girls. That's entirely different thing. We're talking something here that's probably somebody that's on a spectrum of stuff.
Just like all of us.
And she can't help that she has maybe a lot more testosterone, a lot more.
And none of us can help that, really. We did not choose how these bodies were formed.
Right, but this huge controversy now, and you can imagine kickback she's having.
Oh, absolutely.
Hatred and judgment.
And you can imagine her sense of distress over all of that.
Yeah, so maybe it's not like some people think it's a malicious, pre-planned thing. Maybe it's not, folks. Maybe this is legitimately somebody that's on the spectrum of,
that's just where she is on the continuum of the hormone formation, the physical development, her gender identity. That's her painting.
Yeah, and I think, and not even just like identity, it's a physiological.
Yeah.
But, which brings up an interesting point that online, doing some research, there are people throwing out, well, there was so-and-so back in this Olympics, or there's this back in the day, and you'd see a picture of them like, wow, they're very masculine looking, and it was a female, she did really great in that sport. So how long it's been around, this stuff happening, but we haven't thought about it or pinpoint it like we are right now.
That's right.
And maybe things, because our environment has gotten so complex with toxicities and different influences that maybe there is a lot of different things happening biologically with us. Who knows?
Hard to tell, what's new, what's old. What we do know is that there is a continuum in terms of hormonal and genetic formation, in terms of how people wind up looking when they come out of the birth canal, and what we wind up feeling in terms of how we identify those things.
And it's very, just think for us that have had a clear identification, that it hasn't been easy going through life, right? None of our lives are easy, but just think if you come in a way that's not an accepted way, in society, yet it's true to who you are.
It's true. It's
how
accurate,
difficult that would be.
It's valid. And in terms of terms, the term is heteronormative for the black and white binary model. You're a male or you're female. That's considered the norm. Is heteronormative. Then anyone who's not in that binary is hetero non-normative. So imagine being called non-normative.
Yeah, be normal.
Right. So what does that mean, and what does that do to people? This is like the way I was born. This is,
I'm sorry, but this is me. Which I'm about authenticity. So, this is where, and this is kind of another little segue here. We don't have to go off in this, but what really comes to mind is how there's different, like the whole woke movement, and on either side of the spectrum, whatever you want, you're going to be far right, far left, that there's enough truth and lies and disinformation mixed in.
Always.
So the woke thing, there's like, oh my God, it's taken to such extreme that there's just ridiculous stuff. This is, come on, wake up, use your head with it. But then there's things that are so legitimate. So so if you're listening to this, don't go off on this thing of putting all the other woke stuff on this conversation because you want it to be safely fit in this or this category. We're not saying that transvestites or whatever should come in and read stories to kids in grade school and introduce sex to them. We're not saying the far agenda.
We're not saying they shouldn't.
We're not going there. We're simply talking about biology and
just the way
gender
these bodies are formed.
Identification, and it's just a really complex situation that is to have some like compassion and some heart with it.
The more we can understand, the more we can be compassionate and accepting. And the saying to know is to love. To understand and keep our open minds and open hearts. Absolutely, and be able to think clearly without our fear interfering, without judgment of ourselves or others. What a more wonderful world that would be, wouldn't it?
That would be so more wonderful. And how this all resolves, what the answer to it is. Let's say in women's sports, which women have fought so hard to have their own separate sports, and we don't ever want to take away from that. But it's clear that there are some questions arising now about how to classify that. And I asked you about that last night. It's like, well, what do you think the answer is to it, Maria? And what did you say?
I said, I think the Olympic Committee is going to need to think about that.
Exactly. But you also proposed like a very interesting...
I was thinking about, for example, in certain sports like wrestling, that there are weight restrictions for categories.
Lightweight, midweight.
Exactly. They are not naming that person's identity or their preferences. They're just saying, if you weigh this much, you get to
fight
play
another
here.
person that weighs that much.
That's right.
It's equal.
And there may be a way that the Olympic Committee can consider certain categories of strength or
with hormonal makeup.
Possibly.
Because it kind of,
Possibly. Thankfully, that's not my task to figure out.
Thank God, it's not mine either. Nobody's asking me to say like, all right, we're going to figure out right here and it all. No, thank God it's not there. And I think there's going to be some bumps along the way, as there always is when new things come in.
When we're thinking about things in a new way, we don't have it quite figured out at first.
No, and there's going to be mistakes along the way, and then there's going to be corrections.
We hope that we can make corrections and behave in a beautiful, loving way with one another, and make a lovely world that all of us can feel welcome in.
I love that, and I'm gonna just end it with that, because that's a beautiful and thank you so much. And I hope that this was just helpful for you, because I felt I made a really not educated I made a very emotional response on thing. I made a video on it, and I just wanted to fill it in and say like, hey, listen, I just learned more. This is what I thought, and now this is what I think.
And how wonderful that you did that, Elisa. And isn't that something we would all like to be able to do, and to say that we do, is to take in new evidence, to be open-minded, to say, hey, I didn't know.
I didn't know, and now I know. Exactly.
So thank you for that.
You're so very welcome. I can guarantee you that on all of my videos and podcasts and stuff, that if I say something and it's just not accurate, point it out to me, and we can do it with love. We don't have to be critical. We can uplift each other. It's not about finding who's right or wrong. It's like, hey, have you considered this? And I've gotten beautiful comments from people. Hey, read this book or do this, and they filled me in on like, oh wow, that's incredible. They add to the conversation. So add to the conversation.
Absolutely.
We love additions with it.
We love that.
We do. Okay. With that, we're going to sign off, and I do this little thing, and I go, peace within.